So that's one of the reasons why we wrote this book, to show that there's actually a lot that can be done in all sorts of communities all over the country. And what we argue in Just Action is that to live up to that obligation, we need to build a reactivated civil rights movement that is formed by local groups in our own communities that are educated about how we got here, educated about the history of segregation, and then activated and ready to take on some advocacy work in their own communities. And, we might think that we're maybe on our way towards reactivating the civil rights movement. We had a racial reckoning in 2020. More people came out to march for Black lives than have ever marched in racial justice demonstrations before. It felt like maybe a new day was dawning. We were turning the tide. We were going to make some change. But then what happened after those demonstrations is a lot of people went home. They maybe put lawn signs on their front lawns. They maybe started book clubs. Maybe they went back to their corporations and hired DEI officers. They maybe issued letters to their shareholders denouncing racism and promising to do better. Now, all of these actions, they're important to build awareness, lawn signs, book clubs, letters to shareholders, but in and of themselves, they don't change anything. So we have to go beyond those performative acts and actually make some change in our own communities. Now, what we argue in Just Action also is that to do this, we should start locally, because even though the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation, once a neighborhood, a community is segregated, to a large extent, local policy, local government maintains and perpetuates that segregation. So if we want to challenge and remedy the ongoing consequences of that segregation, there's a lot that we can do locally and a lot of policies that we can change or enact that can go a long way towards challenging the segregation of our communities. So how do we start to build this activated civil rights movement? Well, we argue that to start, we need to build biracial, multi-ethnic committees in our own communities that are ready to take on this issue. These committees, these groups should have leadership that's both Black and white. And, these committees need to be built on some social relationships and social connections. And we understand that that in itself might seem daunting. We live in very segregated communities. We don't necessarily have social contact with people of other races outside of the workplace. Going about our day-to-day lives, we tend to see people who look like us. So we wanted to show that it might seem daunting, but it's not impossible. There's a lot of examples out there that we wrote about and that are continuing to happen of communities, groups that have taken some intentional steps to bring people together from segregated neighborhoods in their own cities and start to build these social connections and social relationships. So one example we wrote about is from Chicago. This project was started by an artist named Tanika Johnson. She's a photographer. And she took the unique layout of Chicago, which is laid out in a perfect grid. So when you fold the map in half, the north side and the south side of the same street, and the houses with the same house numbers sit perfectly on top of each other. The north side of Chicago is almost all white, the south side mostly African American. So she folded the map in half. It's called the Folded Map Project, and called the houses that sit perfectly on top of each other map twins. And she went and photographed the houses, the map twin houses, and she did an exhibit to show, these houses aren't that different, but they exist in a very different context because of the ongoing consequences of the segregation of Chicago. And then she went a step further and she introduced herself. She knocked on the doors of the map twin houses and introduced herself to the residents and asked if they wanted to take part in her project. And many of them said yes. And to be a part of the Map Twin project, they agreed to meet their map twin and tour each other's neighborhoods and get together over a certain amount of time. And many people who participated in this project, they had lived in Chicago their whole lives and had never known someone from the other side of town or been to the other side of town. They started to develop relationships, learned that they weren't all that different, learned a little bit about how different their neighborhoods were, and then they went on to form block twin groups and do some neighborhood beautification efforts, and this program is just sort of, the relationships are expanding and ongoing.